Okay, let's get started. You brought something interesting to my attention, actually.
I did. It sent us down a bit of a rabbit hole looking into this one particular source, an online video script, I think.
That's right. And the topic is, well, it's these things called Lapopo dolls.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, our plan is really just to unpack that source. We want to explore the claims it makes, the perspective it offers on these dolls.
Focusing specifically on what it says about connections to older practices, maybe superstitions,
Right. We're sticking just to the lens of this one source.
because it really frames a central question, doesn't it? Are these Lapopo dolls just, I don't know, modern art? A quirky trend?
Or, as this source suggests some people think, is there something deeper, maybe even a bit concerning? It mentions links to magic, even the underworld.
Yeah, that phrase definitely stands out. So let's see what the source actually lays out for us.
Okay, so first off, the source paints a picture of what it calls the Lepopo phenomenon. Says they've gotten really popular recently.
They're like spread everywhere, among young people and adults.
That's the description. Spread among youth and adults.
Mm-hmm.
But right away, it highlights this kind of tension.
Ah, the differing views part.
Exactly. Some people, the source says, just see them as art. Modern art, maybe a bit strange, but still just art.
But others,
Others, according to the source, are making connections to, well, magic and that underworld idea again.
And the source itself seems a bit wary of the popularity.
It uses pretty strong language, calls it a strange mass obsession. It even suggests that this kind of intense focus, especially if the object has a dark or frightening character. Well, it hints that maybe something unnatural is behind it.
Interesting framing. Does it mention the market side of things?
Oh, yeah. It points out they sell for exorbitant prices, gives a range like $45 up to $500.
Wow, that's quite a range for a doll.
And it adds that people are actually lining up to get them, which, underlines the scale of this trend, at least as the source presents it, that level of demand for something potentially dark.
Okay, so that's the current picture, according to the source. Where does it trace the roots of this kind of thing? Does it go back further?
It jumps back into history,
Yeah.
makes claims about how dolls were used in ancient pagan cultures.
Right. What specifically does it say they were used for?
The source claims they were seen as a means of communication with spirits. So it's setting up this historical link between dolls and, the unseen world.
And it gets more specific, doesn't it? Something about demons.
Mm-hmm. It mentions a belief that demons can inhabit small bodies, such as dolls, but only after certain ritual summoning, it calls them.
So the source is explicitly connecting historical doll use to claims about demonic entities and specific practices.
Yes. And then, interestingly, it tries to connect that ancient idea to things people might know today. It brings up stories about haunted or cursed dolls.
Like Annabelle. Doesn't name that one.
It does, yeah. Specifically names Annabelle. And it mentions the kind of claims the source associates with it, bad experiences like nightmares or strange accidents for people who get too close.
So it's using these modern, well-known examples, like Annabelle, to illustrate this older idea that dolls might be more than just plastic and cloth.
Exactly. It's suggesting, through these examples, that the belief in dolls having some kind of potential negative spiritual attachment isn't just ancient history, according to its narrative.
Which loops us back to the Lapopo dolls themselves, then. What symbolic links does the source draw there?
Well, it claims the Lepopo doll design is said to be inspired by a gnome creature from pagan Nordic myths.
Okay, Nordic myths. Gnomes. How does the source interpret those myths?
Ah, this is key. The source has a very specific take. It states these myths are full of pagan gods and creatures that represent demons in their reality, as some scholars say.
Whoa, okay, so it's not just saying inspired by myths, it's interpreting those mythological figures directly as demons through a particular theological viewpoint, it sounds like.
Seems that way. It attributes this view to some scholars, but presents it as the relevant interpretation here.
And applying that view back to the dolls, what's the implication according to the source?
The source argues that the attachment people feel, the desire to own one, isn't just about a doll. It's framing it as an attachment to something that contains mysterious symbols and foreign ideas.
Implying those symbols themselves are inherently problematic from its perspective.
That seems to be the core argument, yes. That the symbolism carries a weight, a potentially negative spiritual weight.
Right. But then the source does offer a clarification, which feels important.
It does. It's very clear on this point.
Yeah.
Just buying the doll doesn't make someone a sorcerer or a polytheist. explicitly states that.
So where is the line drawn, according to this source? When does it become a problem?
It calls it the catastrophe of belief. That happens, the source says, if someone believes the doll has unseen powers.
Or uses it for magic.
Right. Or uses it for magical purposes, or even just becomes inwardly attached to it in a way that gives it significance beyond being just an object.
So it's about the internal state, the belief, the intention, the reliance. That's what the source flags.
Exactly. And this is where it introduces a religious quote to back this up. It cites the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
The Hadith.
Yes, the saying. Whoever ties something to himself is entrusted to it. It mentions it's narrated by Tirmidhi.
And how does the source interpret that saying in this context?
The explanation provided is basically about reliance.
Mm-hmm.
If you put your trust, your hope, or attribute power to anything other than God, well, you're kind of left to rely on that thing, with all its limitations.
So it's a warning against misplaced dependence, tying your fate or well-being to an object or symbol instead of the divine.
That's the interpretation the source offers, yeah. It's framing it as a fundamental issue of where one's belief and reliance should lie.
Okay, so how does this fit into a broader Islamic perspective as presented by the source? Does it talk about art or decoration in general?
It does address that. It says Islam does not forbid adornment or art. So the source acknowledges that aesthetics, beauty, creative expression, they have their place.
But there's a but.
Always a but. It immediately adds that Islam warns against anything that violates faith. That's the boundary.
Preserving the core belief in one God.
Right. And it reinforces this with a quote from the Qur'an, from Surah Al-Hajj, verses 30-31. And shun false speech, being Hanifa true in faith to Allah, not associating anything with him.
That verse is quite direct about avoiding falsehood and maintaining pure monotheism, not associating partners with God. How does the source apply that specifically to the dolls?
It draws a practical line. If the Leopo doll is genuinely merely decoration.
Sitting on a shelf.
Right. And it's not used for forbidden things,
Mm-hmm.
presumably meaning magic or rituals the source disapproves of, and crucially, it does not affect the Muslim's faith. Then the source says there is no harm in it.
Okay, so there's a conditionality there based on use and internal belief.
Definitely. The problem arises, according to this source, if the doll becomes a means to connect with superstitions, or if its symbols are seen to express polytheistic beliefs.
In that case.
Then the advice is clear. One must be cautious and stay away. Avoid it.
Got it. So the focus seems to shift towards the end, doesn't it? More towards the individual.
It does. The source issues a kind of call for self-reflection. It specifically addresses people who might feel drawn to what it calls the doll's dark or mysterious nature.
Instead of just judging the object, it's asking people to look inward.
Exactly. It poses questions it wants people to ask themselves, like, why do I want to own something terrifying?
That's a pretty direct question.
And also, does this reflect spiritual emptiness or being swept away by trends?
So probing the underlying motivations, is it a genuine aesthetic appreciation, or is it filling a void or just following the crowd?
Right. It pushes for that deeper self-examination, and it backs us up with another hadith.
Which one?
Part of the perfection of a person's Islam is his leaving that which does not concern him. Also narrated by Tirmidhi.
How is that one applied here, leaving what doesn't concern you?
The source seems to use it to suggest that getting caught up in potentially dubious things with maybe dark or superstitious associations, well, maybe that's something that doesn't concern it. A believer focused on their faith. It's presented as something perhaps spiritually unproductive, best left alone.
So pulling it all together then, what's the main takeaway from this specific source we've been examining?
I think the core message is really about discernment. The source stresses the need to distinguish between things that are genuinely harmless, just art, just decoration, and things that, from its specific Islamic viewpoint, might carry problematic symbolic weight, or could lead someone towards superstition or away from core beliefs.
It's about knowing the difference and being careful about what you engage with.
Precisely. And its final thought really hammers this home. Not everything that looks cool or interesting or even strange is necessarily good for you, spiritually speaking.
And that your own beliefs, your inner state, that's more important than any trend or object.
Yeah, especially if that object comes loaded with these kinds of interpretations or potential associations, according to the source.
It definitely gives you food for thought. It leaves us, and you listening, with a question, I suppose.
Which is?
Well, how do we navigate this world full of objects, art, trends that might have hidden histories or symbolic meanings, whether those meanings are intended or just interpreted through a specific lens, like the one in this source we looked at today.
Yeah, and what responsibility do you as an individual have to understand the things you choose to bring into your life? How do they square with your own values, your own beliefs?
Definitely something to mull over, a lot to consider based on this one perspective.